It's not going to happen. So you have to be realistic in your expectations, and you have to be truthful with the general public when you're talking about things. It is fine to try to make political points and get people who may be on your side to jump up and say, yeah. But the reality is still the reality tomorrow, the day after, the week after, the year after, or a century after. It's not going to change by talk. It will not change by talk. And so, Mr. President, I am glad, again, I support the idea of making the changes that are necessary. And the main thing that I want people to understand is that it shows a certain amount of maturity when a government can look at a situation and say, you know what? This decision we made on the first time might not have been in the best interest of this institution or the country or the people of Barbados or whatever, and make a conscious effort to redress it. Because we've seen in too many instances in this country, and as a Calypsonian, having to write about some of the issues, you've seen many times where decisions were taken that could have been reversed in order to avoid problems. But because of, I suppose I would say in some instances, ego or thank you, or other considerations, that decision remained to the detriment of everybody. Rather than being big enough to say, you know what, this is not working, let's change course. Let's go back to what was working before. So I applaud government for taking these steps, but I also want to, and it's been done before, but I too want to lend my 2 little cents in terms of applauding the persons who work in the healthcare system in Barbados. They do a phenomenal job. And it is difficult sometimes when we come through certain things, such as a pandemic, and we could celebrate the workers, and we do all, we say all kind of nice things about them and everything, but then when things go back to normal, we go back to the same old again. Not understanding that these are human beings that you're talking about. People who have their own personal problems too that they have to deal with. People who work extremely long hours. People who are working, like I said before, under not necessarily the ideal conditions, but the best conditions that are available, and do a phenomenal job. And I think sometimes, not that I'm going to say that on every occasion that persons are going to be right in the manner in which they deal with people, but I think sometimes we have to be empathetic. Not necessarily sympathetic, but empathetic. To put yourselves in someone else's shoes and try to understand sometimes what may be the problems that they themselves face that cause them to behave in the manner that they behave at any given time. But I want to, again, give kudos to those persons working at the QEH. I give kudos to the minister responsible for bringing this before us. And I am clear and very certain in my mind that as we move forward, that things will improve, that things can only get better. And I am hopeful that the Barbadian public will, whenever they get the opportunity, rather than just use the call-in programs to cry down everybody and everything, as if you are living in a country that has accomplished nothing at all, ever in its existence, either post-independence or pre-independence, that they can find some time in their hearts and in their minds to give credit where credit is due. Regardless of what your political leanings may be, or your religious leanings, or whatever. I believe that the sign of a highly evolved society is one that can celebrate when it does well, one that can critique when it doesn't, and one that can also admit when it can do better. And I think, Mr. President, that in this case, this government is seeking to do better. And this problem with the Queen Elizabeth Hospital is not new. It is not new here, and as I said when I started, it is not a unique problem to Barbados. And this is not to say that I am saying that because it's not a unique problem to us, we shouldn't discuss it. Of course we have to discuss it. And of course we have to critique. And of course we have to try to ensure that things are better for the people of this country, you know? But I always ask people to always keep sight of the most important things. That at the end of the day, regardless of which political party is in, regardless of what the makeup of this Senate or Parliament on the whole is, we are all Barbadians first and foremost. You might not get it right on all occasions. Can we do things better sometimes? Yes, we can. But I know, and I'm not saying I think, I know, 99.9% of the times, when we set out to do anything, we do it with the best interests of the people who make up our families, our friends, our work colleagues, or whatever else, sports people, whatever. We do it with them at top of mind. And so, Mr. President, those few words, I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Senator, Most Honorable Dr. Walker, please wrap up.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I first of all want to thank all honorable members who contributed to this debate and for the support for the amendment to the QH Act. I, however, would have to respond to some of the comments made by Senator Walters. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, Mr. President. He made a number of charges, but I understand, I realize that the speech that he read from was one that was probably written a week or two ago, and it bore clearly not by him, and clearly with no reference to the speech that I made this morning. I would not have wasted so much time repeating things that I've said were going to be addressed and how they were going to be addressed. Nevertheless, he made the assertion or the claim or the wild rant about the QH functioning effectively and efficiently up to 2018. I'm not sure where he was, Mr. President, but throughout that period, certainly between 2014 and 2018, QH always seemed to be in the news. There were issues, there were the same issues of waiting times, but there were major issues about procurement, and procurement from a company of which the procurement manager was a director in Miami, and things were supposed to be in purchase. And this was around, so I don't know exactly where he was, but perhaps if he doesn't know about these misgivings and deeds within the QH, perhaps he should take the opportunity to do some research. He made some comment about the former CEO being fired. I believe he met Mr. James, Dexter James, Dr. Dexter James, but he left on a holiday, and as far as I know, he never came back to Barbados. He left his position, he abandoned it. So these are the little things that we need to have clarified. David Thompson Clinic, I know the Deputy President dealt with it, but I still have to make the point that we did the preparatory work. And it's not true to say that nothing happened until the DLP came back to government. In fact, when they came back to government, the preparatory work had not only been done, it was a project in the PPC. And the Prime Minister at the time had committed and agreed. We had drawings, and it was to be done in over 2 years. I believe you all took quite a while to do it. But more importantly, we had visited Cuba, and we had seen how the Cuban system works. Where polyclinics treat asthmatics, they stabilize heart attacks, they had ambulances, they did all manner of things. And the discussion we had at that time was to use this David Thompson as a model for how we wanted polyclinics to be. We lost the election. It is that you all completed the project, the DLP that is, but you ignored the plans and the concepts. And rather than taking the opportunity to develop a state-of-the-art polyclinic in Barbados that could serve the eastern part of the country and be like a mini hospital, you then embark on a frolic to build a clinic and add on booths, selling lotto tickets and hairdressing salons and a community center and sweet drinks and all of this. I mean, so these are some of the things, you know, but I understand, Mr. President. I'm not being very hard on him this evening. There'll be times for that, certainly, in this chamber. Certainly, we have the budget in 2 weeks' time, where we'll get the opportunity to listen to him for 1 hour and hope that we don't need cochlear implants when we're finished. But again, I thank you for your support. And I certainly enjoy the interaction. Thank you. Senator Maynard, incidentally, interestingly enough, supported the resolution. I thought he had some misgivings from the last time, because the last time he didn't seem to be certain where he was going with it. He came asking me after what was my position, but I had led the debate, so clearly he knew my position. And I will look into this matter of Iran. I was listening to it, but I'm mindful that the phase 3 was in the basement aspect, and you built the annex at a higher level. So there has to be some communication, but it's something I will look into as you raised it. The matter of floor, I mentioned it, and that is something that we had to look at as it relates to the management of patients in the accidents and emergency. I thank the Deputy President for her historical intervention and also the bit of politics to it and the reality of DLP versus BLP, even in the realm of healthcare. Mr. President, I again want to thank all honorable members for support, and I beg that your honor do not leave the chair. And the the chamber resolved itself into committee. I was wondering, because in this procedure, it doesn't have that anymore, so I was wondering if you all modernize the process. I'm sorry, sir. I beg to move that this bill be now sent for the second time.
Thank you very much, Senator, Most Honorable Mr. Walcott. The question is that this bill be read a second time. Will all honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Beg that your honor do not leave the chair, and the Senate resolve into committee. Is having a committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that you do not leave the chair, and honorable the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill. Will all honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The Honorable Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clause 1 stand part.
The question is that clause 1 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, with your permission, clauses 2 through 6.
Madam Chair, beg to move that clauses 2 to 6 stand part.
Permission is granted, and the question is that clauses 2 through 6 do now stand part. All honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Report.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Walcott.
To move that this bill be now read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. And thanks, the ayes have it.
I beg to move, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Queen Elizabeth Amendment Act 2024.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Queen Elizabeth Hospital Amendment Act 2024. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited.
Order number 4, sir. In the name of Senator the Honorable Dr. Chantal Monroe Knight, Minister in the Prime Minister's Office, to move the second reading of the Caribbean Community Movement of Skilled Nationals Amendment Bill 2024.
Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for recognizing me as I stand to lead debate on the Caribbean Community Movement of Skills National Act, CAP 186A. Essentially, Mr. President, the amendments that we will be discussing today seek to make better provision for 3 categories of skilled nationals, namely domestic workers, agricultural workers, and private security officers. Essentially, the amendments seek to make provision for a better classification and definition of these 3 groups of workers under the Movement of Skilled Nationals regime. Mr. President, one of the books that I have been reading in 2023 and continue to read is Essential Owing. Essential Owing is a book that speaks to the speeches and statements of former Prime Minister, God rest his soul, the Honorable Owen Seymour Arthur. And in that book, there is a whole chapter, chapter 2, that is specifically dedicated to the statements and speeches of the former Prime Minister on the single market and economy. In that chapter, and even throughout the book, the former Prime Minister links the future, links the fortunes of the region with the movement, with the development of the regional integration process, and particularly the Caribbean, the CSME. In a speech in 2000 in Georgetown, Guyana, the Prime Minister said that the region found itself at a crossroads between 2 worlds. He said, the world of traditional trade preferences and the world of trade liberalization. And in order for us to be able to effectively navigate between those two worlds, the Caribbean needed to make sure that it made a concerted movement towards the implementation of the CARICOM single market and economy. Indeed, Mr. President, he said the Caribbean must now become a free spirit and challenge the region to ensure that it harmonized its policies in order to make sure that it came to fruition. In fact, in 2004, at a conference in New York, the former Prime Minister went on to say that the CARICOM single market and economy was a historical imperative. He said that despite the challenges, despite the fact that as we sought to implement the CSME, that it looked like if the benefits would be minimal, that the single market and economy was a historical imperative. He said the single market and economy would allow for the region to be able to address two of the most critical problems, two of the most critical challenges that was facing it as it sought to navigate the changing world economy that it was finding itself in. The former Prime Minister saw the CARICOM single market and economy as that effective bulwark that would help us, help Barbados, help the region be able to address the challenge of expanding our markets and addressing the issue of competitiveness. But the second major challenge that he spoke to that the single market and economy would be critical to helping us address was to meet the aspirations of the Caribbean people, to meet the aspirations of the Caribbean people, Mr. President. Mr. President, our current Prime Minister is continuing that legacy. She is currently the lead head of government with responsibility for CSME in the CARICOM quasi-cabinet. But Mr. President, many would ask, why has various administrations of the Barbados Labour Party continued to be a champion, continued to champion, Mr. President, the regional integration movement and the CSME? Starting, Mr. President, Mr. Grantley Adams, who was the first only Prime Minister of the West Indies Federation in 1958. Mr. President, it is because this administration understands fully the aspirations of the hucksters and the traders, Mr. President, who helped to build this nation, who came, Mr. President, from all throughout the Caribbean here, who themselves understood, Mr. President, that their livelihoods were not tied to one place, but their livelihoods were tied to the fortunes of the entire Caribbean. Mr. President, our grandmothers and great-grandmothers who sold along this area here that this parliament stands, trading plantains and sweet potatoes and made a living, Mr. President. It is because we as the Barbados Labour Party, understand those aspirations, understand the aspirations of the small business person, Mr. President, who needs to ensure that their business grows outside of the boundaries of Barbados and has an opportunity to be able to expand, Mr. President. It is because we understand the aspirations, Mr. President, of young people who want to be able to take their skills throughout the region and abroad, so that the Barbados Labour Party administration has remained a champion, and our champion of this single market and economy and regional integration, Mr. President, is juxtaposed to the legacy of the Democratic Labour Party, the legacy that we know well. Ever so welcome, wait for a call. Ever so welcome, wait for a call. Juxtaposing the Barbados Labour Party administration that understands the value of the regional integration movement, the CARICOM single market and economy to the aspirations of the people. Mr. President, ever so welcome, wait for a call of the Democratic Labour Party and the Guyanese bench. Mr. President, the Guyanese bench. Putting aside the contributions, Mr. President, as I said, of those hucksters and traders, putting aside the contributions of other people from the OECS who have also come to Barbados and helped build the economy, Mr. President, have contributed significantly. The Democratic Labour Party told them, ever so welcome, wait for a call. Mr. President. Mr. President, I went to school, and I would never forget one of my friends at Springer Memorial. And as I say Springer Memorial, please look forward to us once again winning BSAP. Stop it. That was just an aside, but I had to say it, Springer Memorial first again in BSAP. But yes, as I was saying, Mr. President, that's an aside. I had a friend, Mr. President, whose mom was one of those hucksters and traders. And I remember visiting her quite regularly after school and noting that her mom would speak of her work, would speak of her aspirations for her children. Her mom, even before they left school, secondary school, had actually put aside enough money to be able to purchase land for them, to make sure that they were secure, Mr. President. And even though she was not born in Barbados, but her children were, the aspirations, she kept her identity, but her link to Barbados, Mr. President, was strong, And like I said, it is that linkage, it is those aspirations that the Barbados Labour Party has continued to make sure that we support. So that every moment, we have made sure that we have continued to support the single market and economy and all of the necessary legislative and policy initiatives that are going to be necessary to carry forward this movement. Mr. President, I don't think that there is anybody that has to tell Barbadians about the benefits of being able to travel for work and how it increases and improves economic opportunities. Actually, Mr. President, there was a time in every Barbadian household, you had at least one person who was overseas because they had immigrated in order to be able to work, to send back barrels, remittance to their families. And it was those remittances, Mr. President, that were very, very important and crucial into making sure that those families survived, Mr. President. Mr. President, the statistics suggest that between 1948 and 1970, nearly 500,000 people moved from the Caribbean to the UK, to Britain, to be able to work and to be able to find opportunities. And although many of them ended up being unfairly treated, and that's why we had the Windrush scandal, those citizens moved in order to be able to explore the economic opportunities and to make better for their families and help the development of their countries. Mr. President, actually, in fact, it is suggested that between 1955 and 1966, more than 27,000 Barbadians migrated to the UK, working throughout the London transport system, working as nannies, working across a plethora of sectors within the UK and contributing to their development. Nobody has to tell Barbadians about the benefit, Mr. President, of being able to move, to work, and help their families, their communities. And Mr. President, it wasn't just to the UK, it wasn't just to the US. I know we have Canada becoming popular, it was also to the OECS as well. In fact, my father was a policeman in Grenada. He left here, left Barbados, and traveled, went to Grenada to work as a policeman for a number of years. He actually was in Grenada during the time of Gary and the Mongoose gang. My father was in Grenada at the time of the revolution as well. He tells stories of what happened that day. He tells stories as a policeman of being given orders of who to go and arrest, Mr. President. He tells stories, Mr. President, of how not wanting to follow some of those orders, how he and a few others went and hid somewhere so that they couldn't be found to carry out certain orders that were being given. So not only, Mr. President, are we talking about migration to the US and to the UK, but we had Barbadians as well all through the Caribbean. And if I begin to talk about the Barbadians that moved to the Panama Canal, that helped with the Panama Canal that went to Panama, Mr. President. So again, you don't have to tell Barbadians about the benefits, Mr. President, of being able to move, to go to another country, to have the opportunity to be able to live and work because they understand it. It is very much part, Mr. President, of who the Barbadian is. It is very much part of our history. There have been books and movies and things written about it, Mr. President. Those opportunities. And sometimes it was hard, but then they were able to be successful. We have Barbadians all throughout the globe, right across the region, Mr. President, that have moved, established themselves, and become successful. So we don't have to tell Barbadians. And despite the fear-mongering, despite the conservative politics, despite the lack of vision, Mr. President, Barbadians understand it well fundamentally. Under the regime, Mr. President, we have what I will call five pillars that make up the CARICOM single market and economy. And of course, one of them, we have the free movement of skills and labor. We also have the movement of services, the movement of capital, the right of establishment, and the free movement of goods. So it's those five pillars that make up this regime, Mr. President. I really will not go into the details of all of the nature of the regimes, because we want to focus now on the free movement of skills and labor, Mr. President. It is, as I said before, and particularly in the context of the philosophy of past Prime Minister Owen Arthur, it is critical, Mr. President, to how we situate ourselves within the global economy, to how we ensure that we are able to be competitive, to how, as a small nation, when we were told by our colonial masters that we have to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, in a world where larger countries than ours, Mr. President, are integrating because they understand the value, are creating economic blocks amongst themselves, larger countries that are better positioned than us, Mr. President, are integrating, coming together under various frameworks because they understand the value of that in the global system that we live in, Mr. President. And we would all agree that yes, we have had some fundamental implementation deficits. We will all agree that it has not been smooth, that we would have liked to see more progress made, perhaps a little faster progress made, Mr. President. But we are at a juncture in the free movement regime, whereas we would have heard that our leaders are now recommitting themselves to ensuring that we have a more expansive regime that would give truth to the aspirations, Mr. President, of people of the Caribbean about where they would want to see their regional integration go and who it should benefit, Mr. President. The free movement of skilled nationals is enshrined under Article 46 of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, and of course it provides for certain categories of persons to be able to move, secure gainful employment in other member states without the need for a work permit. Mr. President, initially, the regime had identified only 5 categories, Mr. President. Those categories were university graduates, media persons, sports persons, artists, and musicians. And over the years, the categories, thankfully, Mr. President, have grown. Because I want to admit, Mr. President, I was a very young activist who was very disturbed when those 5 categories, particularly university graduates, was announced. Because I thought that it ran counter to the ethos of what I understood the regional integration movement to be about. It ran counter to those traders and hucksters that I mentioned before, and their own aspiration and desire. Before there was a regime, they were moving and contributing, and now it seemed to me at that time that we had established a regime which was enabling those that were already enabled and leaving those very people on the outside. Mr. President, we would have seen over the years that as well, the CARICOM leaders would have reflected on this, and we would have seen additional categories being added in 2006, in 2008, Mr. President. In 2008, Mr. President, we had the inclusion of artisans, hospitality workers, domestics, nurses, associate degree holders, and over that period between 2006 and 2008, we would have seen the evolution of the regime to make sure that there was the necessary administrative and procedural processes to be able to give life to the categories, Mr. President, and also as well to set out the qualification metrics for those categories to be able to move. In 2009, Mr. President, it was agreed that household domestics who have obtained a Caribbean vocational qualification, that's a CVQ, or equivalent qualification, would be allowed to move with effect from the 1st of January 2010. And with that decision, by that time, Mr. President, it brought the total number of categories for skilled CARICOM nationals to 10. And then in 2018, at the 18th special meeting of the Conference of Heads of Government, a decision was made to further extend the categories pursuant to Article 46 to include agriculture workers and at that time, security guards. Mr. President, I want to spend some time talking about that category of domestics and artisans in particular. And as I mentioned before, my feelings as a young activist about the fact that the regime was somehow skewed to those that already had a level of capacity that would have been able to move, and excluding those categories that should have been, Mr. President, benefiting from the CARICOM single market and economy. When I was working at the Caribbean Policy Development Center, one of the initiatives that I am proud to say that I advocated for, sourced funds for, was for us to undertake a campaign over 2013 to 2016 to make sure that we advocated on the behalf of domestics and artisans so that they will be able, one, to have a voice in the regime, but more importantly as well, to make sure that the regime will be fit for purpose, that they would be able to benefit. Because even though, as I said, they had been given that right to move in 2010, up until 2013, the process and the procedures were still not in place to be able to give effect to that right. And Mr. President, we undertook that campaign, and that campaign, like I said, was an advocacy campaign, developing position papers. We held technical meetings throughout the region in order to bring the technical people within ministries to ask them why, Mr. President. What were some of the barriers to allowing these categories of people to move? How could we facilitate? But we also, as well, treated to the capacity of the domestics and the artisans by training them, by taking them through the agreement, helping them to understand what was at stake, how it could benefit them, Mr. President, giving them advocacy training. And not only that, advocating at their voice, that they could sit at the table, Mr. President. While the CARICOM technical team was negotiating, we advocated, Mr. President, for them to be able to have that, voice. And Mr. President, I want to be able, with your permission, to identify some of them because it is important. Very often we believe that these initiatives are driven by policymakers, and that is so. But I am not going to betray my roots because I come from the civil society route, and I know that it is the advocacy and work of many of these people that has brought us here, even in the context of the definition, and I'll go on to speak about that. Mr. President, we work with Wilma Clement from the Barbados Workers Union to the extent that we used to celebrate here in Barbados International Domestic Day. And she actually advocated and established a specific unit within the Barbados Workers Union for domestic workers. We worked with Catherine Rochford in Barbados to represent artisans, Shirley Price, Jamaica Household of Workers Union, and Daye, God rest her soul, from Red Thread. Ms. Hermione McKenzie, the Association of Women's Organizations in Jamaica, Mr. Austin Weeks, the Craft House Inc. from St. Kitts and Nevis, Ms. Edda LeBlanc from Dominica for the National Union of Domestic Employees. And we also, as well, Mr. President, to make sure that we had the best technical advice for them, employed Mr. Stephen McAndrew, who previous to us employing him, was the key technical expert driving the single market and economy within the CSME unit, Mr. President. And we worked, as I said, over those years to make sure that we could help these two categories to take advantage of the benefits. And I remember, Mr. President, that when we were working with the domestics in particular, and we were going through the requirements that were established for them to be able to move, that they had some questions about this very same amendments that we are making relating to the definition and even to how they were being termed household domestics at that time. So we're moving from household domestics, Mr. President. Because they said to us, what happens when I have to leave that household to go and to be able to run errands? Does it include the fact that I am in a household working, but that my primary task is childcare, Mr. President? They ask us those questions. They ask us, what is the criteria for the CVQ? How is it going to be constructed? They're going to test me if I boil water, but that's not the only thing I do. If I make breakfast, I have to clean, I have to press sheets, Mr. President, fold linen. They said sometimes I'm the gardener, Mr. President. So they were asking, is all of these various tasks and activities subsumed in what was then termed household domestic? If they go and pick up children, Mr. President, is that included? Is the person who takes care of the elderly, is that included, Mr. President? And these were some of the questions that at that time, between 2013 and 2016, that household domestics were asking us about this particular regime and their ability to be able to participate. Mr. President, I want to, as well, acknowledge the contribution of the CSME unit and Ms. Wanya Earls, because we advocated for her, with her, to make sure that on the agenda, like I said, of technical meetings, that we would be able to submit our papers and that we would actually have domestics and artisans being able to sit at the table to represent themselves. Mr. President, Because if they are the ones that are to benefit, our objective was that their voice had to be heard within the context of the regime. That they were not just beneficiaries, Mr. President, of anybody giving them anything, but that they would have an active voice within the process. And I'm sure that many of them, those that are still with us, to see where we have gone now today in terms of these amendments, in terms of the definitions, would say, too long, but thank God. Too long, but thank God, Mr. President, that we have arrived now at a process in which they can truly see themselves being able to benefit from the regime. And I am also, Mr. President, saying thank God. Because like I said, these amendments, the inclusion of these additional categories is really speaking to the true ethos of the CSME and regional integration. So, Mr. President, we now have these definitions, as I said, that seek to make sure that we have definitions that are fit for purpose. Like I said, moving from household domestic to now a definition that identifies some of the critical activities that household domestics actually carry out. So the definition now includes a person that is engaged in domestic work within an employment relationship, conducting functions, and it names, and I won't go through all of those functions. But Mr. President, it also importantly identifies that the domestic worker is now somebody who provides routine personal care and assistance with activities of daily living to persons who are in the need of such care due to the effects of aging, illness, injury, or other physical conditions, and provides routine care and supervision for children in private residential homes. So covering now, Mr. President, a range of activities that the domestic would normally carry out within the household. The amendments, Mr. President, also speak to the agriculture worker. Before, it just indicated an agriculture worker means a person who holds a CVQ or a NVQ qualification. But now, this definition identifies that agriculture workers are persons engaged in agriculture work in one or more of the following areas: crop farm production, including growing, harvesting fields or tree and gathering fruits and plants; livestock farm production, including breeding and tending of animals, including aquaculture. And in the case of a private security officer, we're moving from security guard, Mr. President. Again, we simply had said before, means a person who holds a CVQ in security operations or any equivalent qualifications, to defining a security officer as someone who provides services for the protection of persons or property, or to prevent the theft and or destruction or the unlawful taking of property. Mr. President, I also want to clarify that while the new definitions does not speak to the qualification criteria, that there is still qualification criteria that has been established for these categories. They're just no longer in the definition itself. And in each case, again, it established clear qualification, many of them related to the CVQ. And I want to speak just a little bit to the CVQ and its importance, Mr. President. Because again, when we worked with the artisans and the domestics, one of the things that they were excited about was the opportunity to get their CVQ, their NVQ and their CVQ. Because whereas the university graduate and the associate degree holder can have a piece of paper, many of them didn't have anything to show. So they were excited, Mr. President, that this regime would allow them to be able to have something to show and to demonstrate that they had the skill and the competency. Because the CVQ is competency-based. It is competency-based. You get tested on your experience. You don't need to have a prior piece of paper, Mr. President, in order to be able to get your CVQ. Somebody can show up at your workplace and test you while you are undertaking that job. You can go to a particular center, Mr. President, and be tested. And it is tested based on occupational standards, so it is tested based on the standard of your particular job. And it is agreed, Mr. President. It is agreed by all. So that there was excitement amongst that group of finally being able to have their work that they do fully recognized within a legitimate regime. But as I said before, Mr. President, the concern was just to make sure that the standards that would be set would actually be applicable to what it is that they would do. Mr. President, I remember when I started out in the Barbados Medicinal Cannabis Licensing Authority, that again, one of the first things that we were looking at as well was to establish a CVQ for medicinal cannabis workers. Because the intent was that we took some of those that were perhaps undertaking it illegally, Mr. President, and be able to have them certified for the medicinal market so that they too could have something which they could hold up and say, this is my qualification, this is my skill, and it is tested, and it is proven that I am qualified in this area. So that the CVQ regime, under this free movement, has also meant the empowering, Mr. President, of a former class of workers that could not before had something to take and show. And importantly, it is portable. So you move with your skill certificate from one country to the next, and to be able, Mr. President, to have it recognized. And that is an empowering element, Mr. President, of the entire regime. Mr. President, I would know that currently we are not having the level, perhaps, of migration as we used to previously, and it has changed. So perhaps people are not leaving to work for 10 years, 12 years, 20 years, Mr. President. But I note that we have people who are moving to Canada, moving throughout the region for specific time periods. There are Barbadians who leave here and go to work in the OECS, around Carnival, offering their services in the cultural arena, makeup artists, fashion designers. Mr. President, there are those who leave here and go to Canada for the summer, again offering lashes, Mr. President, doing hair braiding, because those services are in much demand. So that Barbadians, again, understand the need for it. And though the dynamics may have changed, Mr. President, the need to be able to move and to work is still very much present, is still very much important. And I know that there have been concerns around the issue of brain drain. There have been concerns, Mr. President, around the issue of whether or not we are replacing outside labor against our labor, Mr. President. And those are not Barbados concerns, those are global concerns for all countries who are experiencing migration, and particularly with small populations. But those are concerns, Mr. President, that we must contend with, not run away from, not take a conservative approach. Because, Mr. President, as I said, for a country that has had a history of migration, of movement, of Barbadians contributing to the development of other countries, and having others come here and contribute to ours, what would happen, Mr. President, if we say no? No. No movement, we don't want nobody, and we ain't moving either. What would happen? We lock off opportunities, Mr. President. We lock off opportunities for growth. This is why the African Union, Mr. President, is running after greater integration, is running after their own regional framework because they understand the benefits of having people move, interact, grow, investment, innovation that is spurred through such movement. And I'm challenging us, Mr. President, I am challenging us that we have to remember, because sometimes we forget, and those that want to create fear-mongering would want us to forget, Mr. President, our own experiences, the experience of our parents, our grandmothers, and great-grandmothers, Mr. President, would want to forget how some houses were built based on remittances, Mr. President, would want to forget those that left and are still making contributions and are still helping. So what we want for ourselves, Mr. President, we also have to make sure that we have a level playing field sufficient enough, Mr. President, that we can have that level of exchange as well. And that is why the Barbados government made sure that it sought to make the necessary legislative changes to ensure that we were in full compliance, to the extent that once the heads made that decision about the 2 additional categories in 2018, by 2019, Mr. President, this government was making the necessary legislative changes to this act to make sure that we could treat to those new categories and that they will have the full weight, Mr. President, of the law that enshrines their rights within the regime. Mr. President, as I close, I want to note, and again, as I said before, the regime has not been perfect. There's nobody. When I was preparing for this debate, I went back to the writings of Norman Gervin and others who were writing about the regional integration movement, who were writing and did reports and evaluated some of the systemic problems and challenges with the regional integration movement. So that there's no one that would suggest that we have not suffered from implementation deficits. There's no one that would suggest that we have some challenges ahead, that there are some fundamental questions that we are going to have to contend with as we roll out this regime, and particularly as the heads have said to us that they intend to have a regime of full free movement. But, Mr. President, it is not for us to be afraid of that. What the Foreign Prime Minister said, even though the challenges, Mr. President, will come, we must contend because the benefits for the regime, the benefits for us, the benefits for small business and investment will outweigh, Mr. President, what we perceive as those challenges. But it is not that CARICOM and the heads are just sitting back and saying, okay, well, the challenges will come and we will contend with them. But, Mr. President, they have engaged the International Organization of Migration, IOM, to be able to undertake a study to provide us with a full understanding of what are those systemic challenges, to be able to work with the CSME focal points, to begin to unlock systemically, strategically, some of those challenges within the regime. But importantly, Mr. President, they've already identified that one of the big challenges that we have to be able to unlock is that of data. Is that as we continue to build out the regime, we need to be able to have good data. We need to know for sure who is moving and why and what are the skills that are moving. And this work is currently, Mr. President, taking place under the regime. So we're not guessing and hoping and saying yes, as I am saying, to contend, but that there is a recognition that there are going to be some fundamental challenges that we're going to have to address, and we're undertaking the systematic work that is needed in order for us to be able to address some of those concerns. Mr. President, as I close, Again, I issue the challenge. In 2004, former Prime Minister Arthur had said it is a historic imperative. I suggest that it is still a historic imperative. I suggest, Mr. President, that for Barbadians, for Caribbean people, the CARICOM single market and economy, the free movement of skills regime, in our context of declining population, in our context of being able to make sure that we are globally competitive, in the context of the need to expand our markets, Mr. President, that this regime is one that we should make sure has the full commitment, not only of government, but of the people. And that the amendments here, simple as we would think that they are, give life to the aspirations of the people of the Caribbean, the very people who need to be able to benefit. The agricultural workers, the domestics, the artisans, Mr. President. Those persons that with their very hands and blood, sweat, and tears help to build our countries, Mr. President. With those few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged as I fully commend this bill to this honorable chamber.
Thank you very much, Senator Honorable Dr. Moroni. Move to second reading, please.
Yes, please. Mr. President, I beg that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you very much. Any speakers on this matter? Otherwise, I'll put the question. Senator Walters.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I support the amendments to the bill. I see some of the others on the other side are disappointed. It looks that way. But I see the benefits of the regional integration, Caribbean integration, the movement of people. I wouldn't get into quarrels about which government supported it and does not support it and all these things. But what I could say is that we have to put it into context of Barbadian people. This is about people, movement of people. And I am concerned only of what Barbadians will say. What will a person coming out of university will say, or a person now finishing school that is looking for opportunity will say, right? I am very happy that my fellow senator there acknowledged that it will not be perfect, and that in some ways we have to understand the carrying capacity of the country so that we do not put a strain on our resources while we try to move people around the region. And they say that from the context that it is said that Barbados is a destination of choice. You know, we're attractive for people to come. So we know that people will want to come. There's financial benefit to them, the strength of our dollar, the health services that we may provide, the level of education that they can have for their family. They're able then to repatriate funds for their families to do some of the same things that the senator spoke about that we did years ago when our people went to UK and the US, etc. But my consideration here is that based on our positioning economically, how will a person today, a young man or woman today, see these opportunities? Will a young person living in Barbados, not a university graduate, will they be inclined to go to a neighboring island to be a security guard, or to be an agricultural worker, or even a domestic? That is the question that I am asking, right? So I think we have to put it in context of Barbadians and our experience. We have a different experience than some of the other islands that cannot be disputed. I believe then, sir, there's an opportunity for communication, better communication for our people to explain to them what benefits are there for them. Because we believe that they believe now that the only opportunities that they have are going to Canada, are going to the US, as opposed to going far away, where they're closer to their family, where it's cheaper to come home on weekends, etc. But the question that I think they're going to be asking is, what are the opportunities that are there for them? Right? So I see the benefits. I think that is something that has to be embraced. We must support it, sir. The next thing is that when you just suppose that then on the CARICOM heads and the governments, successive governments promoting this regional integration, which is commendable, I think we must not feel as though, citizens must not feel as though that the government is passing an obligation that they have to them onto another territory. And that's important. And this is not only for Barbados, but it is for other territories as well, that they must not feel that they're passing the responsibility for them to provide proper housing, proper health, proper education, a decent work, and decent pay for their employees. And I would encourage the government to ensure that it maintains its obligation first and foremost to the people of this country, and then we can seek to make other people comfortable as well. As we speak, sir, there are about 11,100 persons based on the last statistical report from the Barbados Statistical Service on unemployment. The 11,100 persons that are actively seeking gainful employment in Barbados. 8,600 of those persons are under the age of 44 years old. So all I'm saying here is that in principle, there has to be support for it, but there has to be consideration, one, for the carrying capacity of the country, and two, that the obligation of this government must be to carve out a way that these persons can first, or can have here as an option, a very viable option that they can find out employment, and they can have a decent standard of living as well. So, sir, as I said, I agree with my fellow senators with this bill. I support it, but I think there has to be consideration for those two very serious aspects in terms of the capacity of the country, in terms of how fast this happens, in terms of the influx of people, given the categories that we're opening in, and then the communication has to be increased so that our people get an understanding of what opportunities are out there in the region, and then they can decide if they're going to take it. And the obligation of the government of Barbados is to continue to carve out a way to make sure our young people have opportunities here at home. Sir, I thank you.
To Senator Walters. Senator Reverend Dr. Rogers.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for acknowledging me. I rise to, like the previous speaker, lend my support to this particular piece of legislation as we seek to broaden the scope of persons who can ply their trade throughout the region. This is particularly close to my heart, sir, as anything that comes up with the Caribbean community for me is very important because of my experience. I've said it before in this place, I am the child of a Barbadian mother and an Anguillian father, and my paternal grandfather was from Marigaland. And I grew up in St. Kitts in my earlier years. My cousins are in St. Martin, and my cousins are in St. Martin, Anguilla, Antigua, all around the place. I was born in the Dutch territory of St. Martin. You know, so for me, my wife is Barbadian. And so is my daughter. And my mother was Barbadian, as I said. So this is very close to my heart because for me, I have never been able or know what xenophobia feels like or anything like that because as far as I'm concerned, when we look at the historical context of our people, we are a perfect study for that biological theory of spatial isolation, where if you have one organism and somehow it lives in a particular territory and some catastrophic event takes place, the territory gets divided and the two populations cannot mix for a long time. Over time, they develop based on the conditions within the particular context, and by the time you bring them back together, they don't even look alike sometimes. And I believe that the Caribbean region is a perfect example of that. Not in a physical sense, but ideologically and psychologically. And I believe that we have a good opportunity now to bring it back together. Not out of some nostalgic view, but because the world is telling us that. The conditions of the 21st century are telling us no man is an island. And no island in this region can exist on its own. That we need now to come together. And though the Federation was not an original idea of ours, that we must forge a CARICOM union that is somewhere very close to the ideals of what the Federation should have been. If we do not do that, we will continue to struggle in this world. We will continue in this region to be like crabs in a barrel, just jumping on each other to say, I am better than the other person, when all of us are in the same barrel. But I believe that if we can come together, and close that gap of spatial isolation, close that gap of those things that made us believe, don't mix with those people from the low islands because they're different and their traditions are different, and how we had different things to designate different types of people in this region. Some are pickpockets, some are this, some are that. Let us remember that we are all the same people. We were just separated spatially for a long period of time. But in as much as we know that now, we have the opportunity to reverse the process. And I believe that this particular amendment is calling us to do so. And not only this amendment, but the discussions that were had at the 46th meeting of the heads of state recently, where they're looking at full and free movement throughout this region. That is somewhere we have to get, because we're the same people. I've said it before. Barbados has done extremely well. There are other countries in the region that are doing extremely well. But when you look at it on the global stage, Barbados is the size of a mid-sized town in the US. A mid-sized town. And so we have to realize, if we are going to, as the world is telling us, you have to trade on our level no matter how big you are, no matter what you have or don't have. It is time for us who are the same people to come together and to make that difference. And it's quite a coincidence that this bill is being discussed at a time when Haiti is once again going through a period of turmoil. Because when we talk about movement of people and free movement of people, Haiti was the example of that. Haiti was the first free black nation in the Americas. And they were the place where persons, maroon slaves, ran to, and they welcomed them. And nowadays, some of the key refugees that people are seeking to keep out of their territory are the Haitians themselves. I've highlighted that to say, sir, that in this region, we had a University of the West Indies set up, but set up in such a way that encouraged cross-fertilization of persons and ideas, because different disciplines were stationed in different places. You had to move, you had to interact. And it is through that moving that people realize, but there's no difference here. There's really no difference between us and them. let us remember that regional travel didn't really start until the 1950s or so. So imagine from 16-something to 1950s, it's a long time of spatial isolation. We're still new in getting to know each other. But the world is pushing us to make that move now. And it's unfortunate that one of our nations have said that they're not ready yet for that. It's unfortunate. But as Black Stalin said, we're the same people who made the same trip on the same ship. And it is time that we pull ourselves together. But permit me to digress a little bit, sir, because I cannot speak of free movement of people, and I commend the broadening of the categories to incorporate more persons, and I look forward to the time when we can have full free movement. But in order to move, you need transportation. And that is one of the biggest problems for us in this region right now. I just returned from the Bahamas, sir, and it was such a pleasure to see little children traveling from one little island to the next on their field trips and so on, because you have Bahamas there, you have Turks and Caicos Express, you have Inter-Caribbean, there's movement. Since 2021, we have not had that movement. If you want to get from here, I wanted to get from here to St. Martin because my godfather died. My godfather was very instrumental in my life. It was around Christmas. And I looked at the flight to get to St. Martin. It was taking me 2 days. I couldn't go because by the time I get back Christmas, I have a parish to run. And that should not be so in a region, in our region. Now's the time when we need to get our people moving even more. I believe it was Prime Minister Roosevelt Scarrett who made the point that all regional governments need to contribute to then react, to ensure that, because we all benefit from it. And I'm very pleased that just over a month and a half ago, the three bigger nations here in the sub-region, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados, have come together to at least see if we can introduce a ferry system, hopefully by the end of this year. And it's good that based on the base price that has been quoted, that it'll be just about 100 US per person plus taxes and so on. And that's a great improvement. But of course, it's only covering a few areas. But it's a start. And we really need to make some decisions about ourselves as a people in this nation. As I said, I don't know what xenophobia feels like. I'm Catition, I'm Dutch St. Martin, I'm Antiguan, I'm Anguillian, I'm everywhere. I'm Barbadian. And I just returned, sir, I'll close here shortly, from the Turks and Caicos Islands. I was in Providenciales, then I went over to Grand Turk. And it was like moving from St. Martin to Anguilla. The same type of terrain, the same everything, the way the people operate is the same. It just goes to remind us that we are the same people. Do you know how many brothers and sisters were separated because some got dropped off here and others got dropped off elsewhere? That's who we are. Yes, we have our little kingdoms in terms of our governments and so on, but the reality is that if we do not pull together in this region, we're doomed to fail, especially in this 21st century, because nobody really cares about you. You're just another statistic. There's nothing wrong with you being a failed state for them. We have to come together. We have to come together as a region and do what is necessary to ensure that our people have greater cross-fertilization. In every sense of the words. I'm too old for that now, sir, I believe I would long to see the day when a young man in Barbados will be able to take his fiancée across to St. Lucia and have a nice lunch on her birthday, or take her to dinner somewhere in St. Vincent, Dominica, or somewhere in the region, and come back without having to worry about how he will pay. We can do that. But we all need to invest in each other and realize that as a Caribbean region, everyone is important and everyone has value. I know it may sound like a pie in the sky wish, but I believe the current circumstances in our world demand that we come together or we fail together. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Reverend Canon Dr. Rogers, Caribbean man. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I am rising to just give a very brief comment today. My colleague, Senator Dr. Chantal Monroe-Knight, has gone through the history of the CSME, how it was established, the free movement regime, the successive decisions that were made by the CARICOM heads and countries as a consequence of those decisions. And so I think we have a very clear profile of what has been done. I, however, rise in the context of being the person with responsibility for the business sector overall. And I want to connect this particular debate to the opportunities to which the Honorable Senator Ryan Walters spoke about what are the opportunities for Barbados. And I want, for Barbadians, and I want to connect this question of free movement of persons, whether in part or in whole, ultimately, as the heads have envisioned, where we have free movement of all categories of persons across the Caribbean region to the other rights that have been enshrined in the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. Now, there are a number of rights that have been established: free movement of labor skills, free movement of goods, free movement of services. You have free movement of capital, and the one that comes at the very end of that is the right to establishment. And I want to connect, Mr. President, the right to establishment to all of the other rights that we have been speaking about. The movement of capital, as was mentioned by my colleague, Senator Dr. Monroe-Knight. The movement of persons of all categories. Communities, Mr. President, across Barbados have seen the hucksters and traders to whom Senator Dr. Chantal Monroe-Knight referred. Mr. President, I have had the opportunity as a chairman of a port to be able to see on 2 days every week the boats coming up from St. Vincent and those hucksters and traders finding themselves into the Bridgetown port and then into the alleys and the byways of Bridgetown to sell their wares and to sell their goods, Mr. President. And they have been able to benefit from that interregional movement of goods on the one hand, and the ability to provide services in their home country as a result of having access to those goods, Mr. President. And we have seen that happening in a range of sectors. But here's what I want to throw as a challenge, Mr. President. At what point will we, as a region, come to the phase where beyond the decisions of the heads of government, beyond the decisions of the CARICOM Secretariat, once the technical officials have recommended them and they have been adopted, when will we, at the implementation level, seek as people to pair these rights that have been afforded to us in the law together for us to create the opportunities of which Senator Walters speaks. Mr. President, the rights of establishment allow for us to create companies. Is there an opportunity for those hucksters and those traders who are receiving the goods under the freedom of movement of goods regime to receive them in Barbados while simultaneously having a company established in the receiving state, in this instance, largely St. Vincent, where they become the company of origin and the company that is receiving here in Barbados, where they're able then, Mr. President, to create employment for Barbadians so that you are establishing a company in another entity, in another country across the region. You are providing the service in that country based on the laws of CARICOM, the laws that have been provided by the heads of state of CARICOM, and then you are transferring those goods under the same rights to another market and moving the capitals, circulating it freely across the region, using the investment mechanisms to also circulate the capital across the region, Mr. President, and creating not just opportunities for yourself, but creating jobs for other Barbadians across the region. There is an opportunity, Mr. President, if we were to take the platform of our regional integration movement in CARICOM, even in our third-party trading relationships with third states. Can you imagine what it would look like, Mr. President, if companies were to establish Barbadians, the entrepreneurial class of Barbadians, people who have ideas and concepts and access to capital, pooling their resources together, establishing companies across the region, and then those companies then using access, again, to the mechanisms that have been negotiated and made available to Barbadians in third states, namely the European countries, for example, 26 countries in Europe under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. One of the primary planks on which the Economic Partnership Agreement of 2008 is based, Mr. President, is CARICOM's single market and the importance of regional integration. But are we pulling those strands together, Mr. President, to create the opportunities that we speak of? And so I don't agree that the question is whether or not Barbadians would want to move to another jurisdiction. I think that, yes, there is the opportunity for education. Yes, there is the opportunity for capacity building. Yes, there is the opportunity for information sharing. But that the opportunities that are available for, say, agricultural workers, for example, can then be translated into that relationship between hucksters and traders, moving between Barbados and St. Vincent, and bringing goods and produce from one place to the other, creating companies, creating the opportunities for jobs, creating the opportunities for movements of capital, is exactly the kind of thing that is contemplated by the framers of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. It is exactly the kind of thing that is contemplated by our heads of government when we talk about free movement across the region, and it is exactly the kind of thing that expands the size of the Caribbean market in terms of business and business creation opportunities to what our region needs now. Now, the second thing that I want to say is this. We have seen the evolution of this movement. We have seen, in support of my first point, this is what I want to say, we have seen the evolution in movement since 1973, when we started this process, and all the way up to 2001, when the revised treaty was started. We've seen the gradual movement that Senator Dr. Chantal Monroe-Knight spoke about. If you were to, there's a paper that I read as we were preparing for this debate that called this the reactionist phase. The reactionist phase to incremental movement, hearing what people were saying and then making gradual changes. You started out with the elitist phase, and you had the UWI and so on, and then you moved into others, and you had other categories that ultimately were added, and you have further. But you have heard now what the heads intend to do with full free movement. And they have defined this latest stage as the activist stage. And the activist stage, Mr. President, is what I want to focus my attention on what I wanted to focus my attention on when I stood to my feet today to speak on this point. Mr. President, the activist phase presupposes that we are right now where we are, and that place we're in now is where we began. We're outside of the decisions of CARICOM, the legislative framework, the administrative decisions, and the unfortunate state where before this government came to office, the judicial decisions on what it meant for free movement of persons entering countries. Before we got to that stage, Mr. President, the hucksters and the traders and people were moving all on their own without any of those things in place. Equally now, Mr. President, the activist phase requires us to say, let us bring the mechanisms that exist already in the freedom of movement of goods, the freedom of movement of skills and labor, the freedom of movement of capital, the freedom of movement of people, alongside the rights of establishment to build and grow Caribbean and pan-Caribbean businesses that are reflective of us, Caribbean development, Caribbean civilization, and Caribbean's contribution to Caribbean wealth. And these are the comments that I would wish to add, Mr. President, as I support this resolution and support the continued commitment for this government to regional integration and to the further expansion of our regional project in the form of the CARICOM single market and economy. I support the bill, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummings. Senator Kevin Boyce.
Thank you, Mr. President. I too rise as a child of CARICOM to add my voice to this debate. Certainly, like my brother to your left, we form the ideological independent core in terms of debates and try sometimes a bit idealistic in terms of our contribution, but I'm sure that they're valued by all parties. Now, sir, while it may not be known, I do have Trinidadian heritage. You probably couldn't tell. I also shared a house with the de facto chairman of CARICOM when I was studying. And I myself have benefited personally from movement throughout the islands. I, as a child, sir, went to school in Trinidad and I was received by the Trinidadians warmly as beige, if not traumatically, as they were then proceeded to let me know the deficiencies in my school equipment. I had a pencil while they were writing with fountain pens. I had my little book with the lines when they had these binders. But after a while and after a fair amount of rigging, I was accepted. Sir, I also grew up hearing these stories about federation, what caused it, everyone with their perspective not to work. We have also heard the stories told in parliaments or in mass meetings about who was coming for whose nanny goat. We hear the famous statement by the statesman, politician at the time when he made the statement, Eric Williams, that 1 from 10 leaves 0. And we know, sir, that this past that we have had within CARICOM has helped shape what we see today. And I do believe in CARICOM, and I do believe that we as CARICOM citizens must maintain the faith even when it's not convenient. Now, sir, the legislation, as clearly set out by the government representatives today and the leader of government business, as well as the senator, the Honorable Dr. Chantal Monroe-Knight, who led off the debate, Minister, have set out clearly the objectives of the government in relation to expanding the category of skilled CARICOM nationals. Now, we have heard the history, so we don't have to go back to the various treaties of Chaguaramas and the revision in 2001 and all that good stuff. Just some political considerations in terms of painting the picture as to where we are. In 2023, CARICOM heads determined that there will be full freedom of movement, which is supposed to be in place by 2024. Now, we of course know that freedom of movement is different from the skilled national certificate. I think that's an important distinction to make when we're having this discussion. Free movement is the one where you're supposed to get 6 months visa-free visit to any CARICOM territory. When that was not done in Barbados, we have the Myrie decision, which guided our courts back and our policies back as to the way of the intention of the CARICOM framers. The skilled national certificate is our way of saying you can work in this territory if you have this certain skill set. And what we are seeing here is legislation to further refine those categories as we seek to roll out the full implementation of what we call the CSME vision. Just a note of reference, there are only 3 countries which allow all the skill certificate categories, all 12. There are only 3 countries, and I'll come back to that point, sir, within CARICOM. Now, when we're having this discussion, I believe the lone opposition member in here today raised the issue with regard to, well, what do we say to Barbadian citizens? And I think it's a pragmatic discourse. I think actually his knock this afternoon was well played, and it invites the response of the government with regard to a question which we, with our ideological and idealistic perspective, might fail to capture a real concern. In other words, if I don't have employment, and you are saying other persons are coming to get employment, would that not make it harder for me? So that's just a legitimate concern, which I'm sure would be addressed in the course of this debate. For my part, with freedom of movement and with increased personnel and people moving to do work, my concern always goes to the how. My concern obviously goes to what we call security concerns with regard to the increased movement. Now, we have previously discussed the importance of impacts on RSS and all the regional security teams. In other words, if we have CARICOM persons coming to move, to do work, we need to make sure that we're all on the same page as to who is coming to do what. And I'm going to come back to that, sir. Another factor that will be coming out in this debate, sir, is whether with the increased movement as is anticipated by the workers, if we increase the skill category, if we increase the number of persons coming, do we have the necessary mechanism within the educational sector for the absorption of the children who will come with these persons? Do we have the facilities within the hospital to allow that they are treated akin to the responsibilities and pay as you go, I believe is the context in terms of CARICOM citizens. I remember it was an issue with regard to, as pointed out by Deputy President Mada, it is somewhat difficult to get the payment process done when you are at the hospital. So these persons, they come to Barbados, they need access to education, they need access to healthcare. Have we worked out the logistics, or have we increased our logistics to deal with any anticipated increase? Now, sir, we should not believe, and I'm going to come back, let me start with the issue of security. I spoke about impacts on RSS. You know, we shouldn't always think that there are persons who are coming to our shores, which means that we should consider this seriously. Matter of fact, we have exported some, dare I use the term criminal talent. Winston Hall, we managed to export him into the territory of St. Vincent. So we should not believe that there are others who are coming to do us harm. We have also sent others to do things in other places that might not cause us to hold our head with pride. No, sir, we need to also look at the citizens in Barbados, and I believe it was mentioned by the leader of the debate, Senator Dr. the Honorable Chantal Monroe-Knight, in terms of we Barbadians who have gone and sought greener pastures overseas within the CARICOM region. Sir, we have heard historically the teachers. I believe that I have a great uncle somewhere down in Trinidad who was discovered. Anyway, we have teachers, sir. We have policemen who went up north, sir. The nurses were widely sought after. Doctors, sir, lawyers and engineers. We are found as Barbadians ourselves all over the Caribbean. So when it's turned around, we ought not to be so harsh in terms of how we receive those who come to our shores. But let's not fool ourselves. This whole concept and this whole debate about skill, national and certificate, yes, it makes sense, but as the previous speaker indicated, it's always happened. I believe leader of government business, Honorable Lisa Cummings. Caribbean people have moved for two reasons. Love, very easily, and business. And we could come and put whatever label we want on it now to facilitate it, but this has been going on in the Caribbean, sir, for a long time. But it's good to bring some structure to it, sir. But sir, I have a bit of a vision. I have a bit of a vision as a citizen of Barbados who has been exposed to CARICOM. You see, sir, while we talk about skill nationals and skill certificates, and I just said CARICOM, we move for love and we move for business, we have seen how the businesses move within CARICOM. And why is it that the businesses who do well or who take advantage of the movement and who've been aggressive in moving in CARICOM are those from the South? What about our businesses? We have $14 billion in the banks in Barbados, sir. $14 billion in savings account, not mobilized, sitting down in our banks. That, sir, is 40 billion Trinidadian dollars. Why are we not there in the stock market, sir? That, sir, this is true calculation, is 1 trillion Jamaican dollars, sir. What are we doing with it here? When I see certain projects coming off the ground that we allow to lay waste as Barbadians, I feel a how. Where is the vision, the entrepreneurial impetus for us to put our money to work? But I digress, but I put it under the handle, sir, of movement of business. Just some fun facts before I get to some issues as well, sir. And I'm obliged to cite my source. This is migrationpolicy.org, where we're speaking to what we're dealing with in the Caribbean in terms of interregional movement. First of all, Barbados is one of the territories which still continues to get a lot of immigration because we are perceived to have a high standard of living. You know, I think, who was it that said the call-in programs, the people call and say everything terrible? I think it was Senator King. I think we sometimes take what we have here for granted. And I'm not doing a comparative thing, well, okay, there are other places that have it worse. I think really as a Caribbean territory, we should sometimes not be too hard on ourselves and recognize what we have and what other persons wish they have. In other words, we all know that I think it was a year or two ago, we're a head of state from the Caribbean had to come here after being assaulted by someone. Allegedly assaulted by someone for treatment. And we take it for granted, sir. But anyway, just a fact. Interregional immigration makes up for 63% of all immigrants in Barbados. Guyana, as of 2019, made up 5% of interregional immigration. The question is, what percentage do they make up now, and has there been a reversal? Interestingly enough, Britain provides 12%. Britain provides 12% of the immigrants to this country, sir. And the total number of immigrants in Barbados in 2020 stands at approximately 20,000 persons, sir. This helps to frame the picture that with a population of 300 and a working force of 110, 120, we need persons to do the work. The question is, why is it that we need persons, but we still have an issue with unemployment? Something isn't adding up. And don't let me get into the issue where the government has raised in terms of the need to have more babies. This is a frank discussion. When we came in here and we had discussion, Mr. President, in terms of the NIS and the need to contribute, we need to increase the population. So how are we going to get this done? These are the type of discussion, this is the type of legislation which allows avenues to increase, but at the same time, you have to deal with the reality. You're bringing persons in, great. Do we have the facilities? Do we have the mechanisms? Do we have the messages? How do we deal with the xenophobic remnants who may say, but what are you bringing them out here for? We got foreigners like Senator Rogers, not Senator Boyce. But you understand the dialogue and the narrative that could be painted. So, just some thoughts as well, sir, and I'm going to end on a serious note soon. I found it interesting that in the course of this research, that Barbados has never signed off on the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. I don't know how, I know we're normally cutting edge in terms of how we do things. So the question is, why is that? And I'm going to show you why that becomes important. Have we signed off on it, or are we in the process? I just came across it. That was in 2020. I'm sure we'll see. Sir, in terms of other closing thoughts, I was observing, and permit me a slight segue as we're speaking about CARICOM. I was observing, sir, there is a recent trial involving an entertainer by the name of Vybz Kartel is the sobriquet. I believe Senator Anduede calls him the world boss, Mr. President. And looking at the trial being conducted by the Privy Council, I felt a sense of pride that our highest court has persons who look like us. I think that's a fair statement that shouldn't draw too much ire, sir. And I think that we should commend ourselves within the CARICOM region and Barbados for recognizing that having the CCJ as our highest court allows not only a sense of pride, but the machinery to allow the CSME to work, sir. And that filled me with a lot of pride, sir. Sir, but on a sobering note, we cannot be discussing CARICOM, and we can't be discussing movement and immigration without speaking, as heralded by our brother Senator Rogers, our cousins in Haiti. We are aware, sir, that members of heads of government of CARICOM are currently meeting in an emergency meeting to determine the position of CARICOM in terms of the UN and the proposed Kenyan-led force. All I can say, sir, is that once again, we turn to David Rudder, the great wordsmith. And we say, Haiti, I'm sorry, for so long we looked away. And why I say that's important, sir, is that Haiti continues to be not provided for within the context of the movement in terms of CARICOM territories recognizing the difficulty with facilitating the movement. And it's not just a magic wand to get up and say, well, okay. I think there needs to be an active messaging, because I heard on the same call-in program a very harsh critique of any potential risk of, let's say, if we took in persons from Haiti or something like that. And I think there needs to be a message, a combined message for all of us, that we have literally to be our brother's keeper, because we need to recognize that we are one natural disaster away from being refugees ourselves. One natural disaster away from being refugees ourselves. So this concept that that's them and who is do and who rough and what are soldiers going across there to do, all that, that's fine. And it is scary. But what choice do we have? We have seen in the past what has happened, the various issues, and there will obviously be a lack of trust. This is a difficult scenario for the CARICOM governments. It's an even more difficult scenario for our cousins in Haiti. And all I ask is that somehow we find a way that we encourage the narrative, that we provide the support, mindful that we have a lot of work to do as a nation in terms of helping our brothers and even getting the mindset across that there, for the grace of God, goes I. Now, sir, that all ties in because Haiti is a part of CARICOM. Haiti, however, does not have the full movement. The only country which says there's no visa requirement as of the time I researched, so I'm subject to correction, was Grenada, I saw. These are practical factors. So while we hold our chests up high and we say X, we must be mindful, how do we do it? But all that aside, I support this legislation. Let's continue to roll out the mechanism. However, while we do it, let's make sure that we ensure the health, the education, and just the note too. For example, sir, a colleague of mine who my friend Senator Nichols knows was here working under the CARICOM Skill National. And the way it works practically is you have to get a certificate from your home country, and then you come to Barbados and the certificate. So it's a very smooth process if you know how to facilitate it. And that's the messaging that we have to get across. And let's also perhaps say, as said by the leader of government business and the leader of the bill, that it's not just about persons coming, but how can we mobilize that $14 billion that we have along with our entrepreneurial youth and get them to go out there, but come back for the babies, please, but get them to go out there and help our Caribbean brothers and sisters. Sir, I support the legislation, and I thank you for the opportunity to contribute.
Thank you very much, Senator Boyce. Senator Nichols.
Mr. Chairman, I am too grateful for the opportunity to participate in the debate. I cannot claim that I am a child of the product of Caribbean Union like Senator Rogers and Senator Boyce, but I can say that my parents, when they fled as young people to pursue opportunities which may not have been afforded to them in the 50s, and left Barbados. My father came back as an engineer and my mom came back as a nurse after spending some time in the United Kingdom. I have benefited from aunts, uncles, godparents who are from all over the Caribbean. And in every sense of the word, when I look back at my upbringing, I can say that I have had that experience through my parents. I know Senator Boyce was trying to draw me into the debate by referring to one de facto chairman of CARICOM. And if it is to me who he's referring, I will wear that badge with honor. Mr. President, I take a different approach to the debate because I am a little bit astounded but still profoundly grateful for the concession by Senator Walters that he has no opposition to the bill. Like Senator Paris, I was actually in this seat, in this same space when the arrangements for the establishment of the Caribbean Single Economy and Market, well, I should say single market and economy because when we were at university, that was what it was called. But when it was formalized, the acronym changed around. And to support the legislation. And I remember, Mr. President, we were part of a group of the members of the party, and they were the Young Socialists. Senator Chad Blackman, Honorable Minister, was the president then with the CSME Warriors. And we went around Barbados trying to sensitize young people and to stoke the discussion on the very simple assumption that our future, our destiny lay with a Caribbean civilization of which Barbados is only a part. Mr. President, it was met with the most raucous, xenophobic opposition. And the political opposition of the day seized the moment to give the impression that we were trying to overrun Barbados with foreigners. And that rhetoric and sentiment ginned up only to win some electoral support on a basis of a nativist approach to governance issues, was perhaps the reason why the Barbados Labour Party was characterized as a party that was looking out for the benefit and the interests of the region and not focusing on issues at home. And I think that revisitation of these themes is important in spite of the concession by Senator Walters, because even in the current debate as to this very minor piece of legislation, and even if we accept Senator Boyce's statistics, that this integration process is not a mass movement of hundreds of thousands of people swarming into Barbados, as the impression is being given. That we still hear these seeds being planted to make Barbadians believe that somehow the government is trying to increase the birth rate or to do something to take away your birthright. And that is profoundly regrettable. Mr. President, the statistics show, as Senator Boyce made claim to those statistics, where the majority of our immigrants come from. And Mr. Chairman, you must forgive me if I draw reference to things that might seem uncomfortable when the political debate was not charged within that framework. But one of the last things that the last Democratic Labour Party administration did was to oppose the efforts by Caribbean people working in this country, paying taxes and national insurance, whose children are born here, but because they are Caribbean nationals working with the benefit of the Skills Nationals program, some of them working at regional and international organizations, oppose their right to vote under the Representation of the People's Act. And so I had the benefit of representing some of those brave souls who sought to challenge the process. And the law is very clear. You can vote in Barbados if you're a Barbadian citizen or a Commonwealth citizen. But for some reason or the other, we took the approach that Commonwealth meant Great Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And outside of that, there's no other Commonwealth citizen. And yes, we celebrate Commonwealth Day. And I remember the trenchant criticism of, yes, back in that day I was not as old as I am now, and I had more hair in my head, the hairline wasn't receding, but you read those comments in the newspapers as what people wrote in, what we were doing, and we were enemies of the state. But what was interesting was when we won in the High Court, the Court of Appeal turned over the decision, we had to go to the CCJ. And when the CCJ restored the original decision to say that Caribbean people are part of the Commonwealth and they have a right to vote in Barbados, provided they can establish that they were in the voting district for 3 months, which is the same requirement for any Barbadian, any British citizen, any Canadian citizen in Barbados, legitimately. And the comments were that, but if the DLP were returned to government, they would pull Barbados out of the arrangements for the Caribbean Court of Justice. And that was one of the last promises that we have heard. And that came against the backdrop of the ignominy of the Myrie case, where the reputation of Barbados, not only the Guyana bench, but it was almost sad to have to come through the airport and see Guyanese nationals sitting on a bench in this country, spurred on by a nativist approach that ever so welcome wait for a call, and too much of winter are coming into Barbados. We need to revisit these things because we like to think that Senator Walters's evolved position of his party might be the position of that party in the future. But these seeds are there, and when we look at what is going wrong in the world, everybody is retreating into a nativist approach to the problems of the world, as if we can solve the world's problems that are coming. We went through an international global pandemic. The ecological crises that we will face, the diseases that we will face in the world, if you look at the problems that the World Economic Report speaks of, the problems for the next 10 years, these are not things that respect national borders. So it is therefore impossible to conceive of a framework to operate as not being part of a Caribbean civilization. So, Mr. President, I anchor my whole approach to this in the words of our former Prime Minister, the Right Excellent Errol Walton Barrow, who, when he was addressing the CARICOM Heads of Government Summit, a mere 6 weeks after he won re-election in 1986, he said that there is an absolute necessity to defend and enhance the solidarity and sovereignty of our regional Caribbean families. He said that there was also an absolute obligation to discover the strategic mechanisms to enhance and that will ultimately lead to the unity of action in all political, social, and economic life in the Caribbean. These are powerful words. And it goes on, Mr. President, and I would have to quote him, if we sometimes fail to comprehend the essence of the regional integration movement, the truth is that thousands of ordinary Caribbean people do, in fact, live that reality every day. In Barbados, our families are no longer exclusively Barbadian by origin. We have Barbadian children of Jamaican mothers, Barbadian children of Antiguan and St. Lucian fathers, and there's no need to mention Trinidad and Tobago, which has always been tied to us, not only by inestimable bonds of consanguinity, but by the burgeoning cross-fertilization of cultural art forms. This fact of regional togetherness is lived every day by ordinary West Indian men and women in their comings and goings. The point I want to make is this. The regional integration movement is, in fact, a daily experience. It is a reality which is lived, but which we have not yet been able to institutionalize. So we live this reality as a Caribbean people, but we have not been able to institutionalize it. So 3 years later, Mr. President, the Grand Hat's Declaration was signed to birth a deeper level of integration other than functional cooperation, which was what CARICOM was about. And the Grand Hat's Declaration led to the creation of the Caribbean single market and economy. But between 1989 and 2004, there was a long period of gestation to bring it into reality. And Mr. President, we sit here knowing that the fragmentation of the Caribbean people, in spite of all of the excellence that our regional institutions like the Caribbean Development Bank, West Indies Cricket, the University of West Indies, the musical and cultural art forms of the Caribbean people that have wowed the world, are some of the best things that we can offer as a proper civilization of people in this world and in the space of the world. But the fragmentation, Mr. President, we need to dissect it, because this fragmentation is not something that is intuitively part of what we do. This fragmentation is something that was part of our colonial experiences, because when the Europeans settled in the Caribbean, they did not create an economic, social, or political framework for regional unity. Colonialism meant that each unit, each island, each territory had to relate to the metropole by the production of raw agricultural produce and extraction of resources. So there was no Caribbean ethos formed. But when we look and examine, when we pull back these barriers after the colonialists have been, I don't even want to say chased out, but they got tired of us and left, and we went to self-government, Mr. President, we then began to realize the sameness of the Caribbean reality. We might call it Aki in Barbados, they call it Guinea in Jamaica and the Northern Caribbean, and Chinook in St. Vincent and Trinidad. Same thing. Our reality is important, is connected in a deep framework. Amazed, Mr. President, that as Derek Walcott says, that the love of a cracked vase when the owner starts to put it back together is more important than when it was made in the very first place. And Mr. President, we need to continue to institutionalize the arrangements for regional integration of Caribbean people. I welcome, Mr. President, the opening of these bans. I want to say to Senator Boyce that I don't understand the distinctions, or I don't share the distinctions that he made, because my understanding of freedom of movement is not related in the way in which he articulated it. It is a much broader framework. And why is it that I can go and present my passport when I go to the United Kingdom and I go to United States, I tell them where I'm staying, how long I'm coming for, but they stamp in my passport 6 months entry. But we want to do that to tell Caribbean people when they come to Barbados, where you're staying, how much money you got, who you're living by, you're going to dance in the clubs. Yes, students of the University of West Indies get asked these questions when they come here. Well, not recently, but there was a time when we were known for that. I almost had to defend but I'm not going to tell that story. Yeah. But the question was asked to my wife, and I responded in the way in which Senator Boyce, I would respond. So I had to give an account for my behavior then. That was many years ago. But, Mr. President, this is troubling to me because we have to, and when I say this, I need to explain what I mean. The expansion of the categories of people who are able to move around the Caribbean because there is a definite right to entry. Every Caribbean person has a definite right to enter any Caribbean country. And this is what the Murray case was all about. This was a commitment given, if I'm not mistaken, under the last administration, but pulled back because they, for some reason, did not inform immigration how to treat Caribbean people when they enter Barbados. But what is the fundamental problem with Caribbean people moving throughout the region? Can you tell me why we would want Caribbean people to come here when the British tourists start coming in the summer months? We want them to come and fill our hotels and come to crop over and all our festivals. Regional travel is being promoted. The BTMA is out there promoting crop over, and we want people to come to fill that gap. But if they turn up here for Easter with their family, they're treated in a way that is disgraceful. Not all immigration authorities act in that way. I have had in my experience, Mr. President, to represent a young lady who was studying at the Pomerine Institute. She was from Trinidad and Tobago. Her brother was in Barbados, driving her car, got into a car accident in which the motorcyclist was wrong, but he didn't have a driver's license. She was dragged from the Pomerine, arrested for conveying a motor car in breach of some provision of the Road Traffic Act, and threatened with deportation because she lent her brother a car that got into a car accident. And the immigration officer looked me in my face and said, a Barbadian could have been killed by that car accident. And she got to go. That is what I call some of the institutional barriers that when we as policymakers make these things and we send these undertones and these doubts about people that look different to us and coming to take our jobs, and the young people on the block can't get work because the government bringing in foreigners. All of these things are reasons why some people in position hold these views. She is a top chef in this country, working in this country to this day at one of our top hotels, helping the Barbadian brand of cuisine to be internationally recognized and adding value to this country. But we have a situation where these things are harbored. Mr. President, I want to see the day that Barbadian capital, like Senator Kevin Boyce has said, finds its way into investment opportunities throughout the region. And I also want to see some of the thriving businesses in Barbados who are undercapitalized take the advantage and benefit of the capital that is out there in the region, particularly our agricultural sector, our renewable energy sector. These are sectors that speak to a future of tomorrow. Mr. President, why is there not more investment in our young people, in our sports and cultural industries, by using the capital in the Caribbean to create leagues, semi-professional leagues in sporting disciplines across the region, and pay them competitively to put on sports and entertainment for us to absorb on our channels and send out to the diaspora, and get some of the young people off the blocks or from on their devices at home, interacting in a way that we as children did not interact. These are the opportunities, Mr. President. If somebody tells you that there's anything wrong, sinister, or bad about regional integration, you should shun them. You shun people like that because they're stultifying. They have no good intention for anybody. Because that is not the lived reality of any of us. Senator Rogers and I, we went to University of the West Indies together, played cricket together. open batting together. He had more success than I. Huh? But when he left, I was able to make the inter-campus team. So, and that reality is etched on our minds and as a lived reality. My children can travel the Caribbean. You know, we have that opportunity. Why are we feeling that if other people of lower echelons are coming? Why is it not the case that somebody criticizing lawyers who can travel and do work all over the Caribbean? Making money. But we trying to talk about security guards, and that is all of a sudden going to stop block boys and block men from working. And that is being spoken with a level of you know, I sometimes amaze myself that it's probably a slow news day, because when you see some people speaking as part of the news, it means that they don't have anything to report. They go and just jump the mic in front of anybody and they start talking, right? And we are being warned that, you know, this is a good thing the government is doing, but at the same time, we gotta be careful, because, you know, we got a lot of people who could be security guards. But why is it that a security guard must always be somebody who's just big and strong and has little education or training? Why is it not possible that at the level of some of the business elite who play their trade in Barbados require a level of sophisticated training and security personnel as they move throughout the region? Why does it always have to be that we must treat these jobs as if they are just, according to what my grandmother said, when you saw a policeman like a big, strong Barabbas, don't got much sense, right? That's what the old people used to call the police. You used to get only big, tough-looking fellas. But the security personnel who might need to move around the region might be those persons who are capable of assessing a situation, assessing a security breach in a room that ordinarily when we walk into this room, we will not see that there's a threat to the breach. And sometimes these personnel can, because having interacted with some of them, Mr. President, I know for a fact that somebody, how do you discharge a firearm if you are shot in your dominant hand? How do you reload a weapon if you are not capable of using your dominant hand? These are things that these security personnel with training can do and enhance the skill set of the Barbadians, who can take advantage of moving throughout the region as well. So I want to assure the members of the public that there's nothing sinister in this move to expand very slightly those additional categories of workers who can move and find work. And their families can come and find work too. Yes, we understand there will be implications for our health system. Yes, we can understand that there will be implications for our education system. But when I checked, we are probably 10,000 students less in our schools than when we were 20 years ago. And if that is not an honest threat, if you look at the number of people who are doing common interest this year, you will see it is a significantly less number of children doing it. So when, Mr. Senator Roger, I'm not going there with you, my wife might be watching this debate. So that when we speak about the decline in the Barbadian population, and we juxtapose the opportunities for the movement of labor, yes, it becomes complicated, because then you have to factor in now, how do you transport the portability of Social Security benefits when we ourselves haven't worked out essentially access to health care? It is universal in Barbados, but there are two tiers and different structures. Some people have insurance, some people do not have insurance. And all these are interesting combinations and permutations that we have as the political class have to wrap our heads around and deal with these matters. But we cannot allow the low-hanging fruit and those issues to stop Barbados from participating in a regional economic integration exercise that benefits Barbados more than the rest of the Caribbean. That is what is troubling, because it's almost as to suggest to us that given our demographic profile, given the high level of human and social development in Barbados that makes us attractive, given our network of social services that we like to bemoan, but are seen by people in the Caribbean as a place to come. I have a colleague who's coming to St. Vincent for medical care in the late stages of pregnancy. She's coming here in a couple of days on recommendations for her doctor to be here. Barbados is a place, and continues to seem to be a place that people should want to come to. All of my colleagues who were at University of the West Indies with me frequently return here, bring their children here to interact with mine, and we relive these memories 30 and so years ago. Barbados is a fulcrum for Caribbean activity. We cannot turn our back on the regional integration exercise of which we are and have been one of the primary beneficiaries. And what we are doing, Mr. President, as a government, you will hear more about this from the government in the next couple of days as we move into the budget in the other place and the appropriations bill here, are things like the gateway, the construction gateway. Because one of the things that we have recognized is that the construction sector has begun to suffer from the exodus of the Guyanese labor force. And if you are building a house or repairing a house in Barbados, you can tell of the effect of it now. And if you were in Barbados before, with the advent of the Guyanese, it kind of made construction even more cheaper for us because the labor wages stabilized, and the Barbadians that were complaining were learning new skills, and construction began to boom and grow. We speak about agriculture, Mr. President. You would have to tell me that apart from the climate issues that we're having, low rainfalls that we're having, issues with soil erosion and degradation, that our agriculture production has not declined or has had no impact as a result of the loss of the labor force, most of which was from Guyana. These are the realities. Barbadians will sign up in numbers to work in the hotels and the various labor exchange programs on the farms overseas, doing seasonal labor and so forth. Not necessarily immigrants would do that work, but they wouldn't do it in their own country. And if you study migration and population as we did when we did geography back in school, human geography, this is a natural human phenomenon. You do these things in a migratory phase, but you wouldn't do it in your own country because you see the advantage of earning foreign currency, higher wages, and so forth, and you become seasonal. But when you come back, when we wouldn't pick up these things. So that we are not facing a difficulty that other countries wouldn't face. But I welcome the earnest representations of Senator Walters for his support for this bill. And I'm not writing him, Mr. President, but I stood here in the face of criticism and had to live with the fact that leaving this chamber and going to play cricket on a Saturday, where there was a single Guyanese in the opposing team, I would get, you get the usual teasing. That's what you want, man. You want all they come out here and play here because of the political position the Barbados Labour Party took. And sir, as I end as I began, if being criticized as a regionalist is something that we have to bear, I think the Barbados Labour Party will take that criticism. The Barbados Labour Party has played an important role in leading regional integration from the inception. The British Guiana and West Indian Labour Congress, of which Sir Grantley Adams led, made the most far-reaching economic, social, and political recommendations to the Moyne Commission in 1938, led that regional initiative. And if we look at that work that was done by our early founders, as this government recognizes its founders in this month of April, we have a proud legacy on which to stand. And the truth is that the Democratic Labour Party has never, until the last administration, differed on this fundamental truth about Caribbean reality. We cannot criticize the Americans who like Trump and then try to treat Caribbean people as pariahs in Barbados. We cannot decry America first and then look at a fellow like Nigel Farage, who spurred on the British in Brexit, and now the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who was on a tour recently, 10 years to save the West, making it believe, trying to make the world believe that if a group of white Anglo-Saxons do not protect their borders from people that do not look like them coming in, the world will come to a crashing end. Mr. President, there are dangers in those philosophies. And sometimes we might feel that in order to gain some political advantage, we would take a space in that kind of political debate and foist it on our people when we know that these are our Caribbean brothers and sisters. Mr. President, I wholeheartedly support this legislation. And I give warning, Mr. President, I will welcome the full movement of Caribbean people throughout the region. Movement, traveling, leisure, pleasure. And I don't agree with Senator Bush. You don't only go for business or love. We travel for cricket. We travel for carnival. We travel to jazz in St. Lucia. We come to Barbados for Crop Over. I remember, and I will close on this, Mr. President, being in St. Vincent on a few days after we officially became a republic in 2021. I was sitting down in a bar in Kingston with some friends. The proprietor of the bar declared that he knew me, and I couldn't understand that because I had only been to St. Vincent once back in 1995, so he could not have known me. He said, I know you. I know your views on matters and stuff like that. And I was like, well, this man's strange. And then he put on the Fire Stick, the Barbados Republic transition, the entire 6 hours of the cultural show, speech of King Charles. And I was fortunate enough to be on that historic night doing commentary on CBC on site. And that is why he said he knew me. But it meant that he had watched it and that they watched it again. And I saw that. And, you know, that told me for the very first time, don't ever doubt yourself as a people. Because this is ordinary people in St. Vincent playing that video on YouTube or whatever the device it was. All the cultural shows, all the artists singing and stuff like that and having a good time. In a country where they had a referendum and voted against removing the Queen as the head of state in that country about less than 10 years ago. And they felt that this was such a remarkable thing in that. This Barbados has a place to lead and to continue to lead in the development of what Ralph Gonsalves called a Caribbean civilization. I had to revisit this because I said to my colleagues near to me, when we passed the original piece of legislation to deal with skill movement into the early 2000s, this Journal of Eastern Caribbean Studies Special Edition, Eastern Caribbean Integration, a Rekindling of the Little Eight, was the basis of my speech then, Mr. President. And I revisited this because when I quoted the Right Excellent Sir Errol Walton Barr, this was going off of quoting him. When Kenny Anthony was quoting Sir Arthur Lewis was quoting in the Agni 8, Sir Grantley Adams. No one knows what the Caribbean is capable of. No one has ever tried. Those are the words of Sir Arthur Lewis as he introduced his book, The Agony of the Eight. Mr. President, it is time we start trying and start telling ourselves that we know nothing about each other. With those few words, Mr. President, I am really obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Nichols. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. President. let me say straight off the bat that I am a regionalist. I'm not make no apologies for it. My, I should say, colleagues in the Calypso fraternity for many years have sung about this very issue, the movement of people. 1979, Black Stallion. 1985, Black Pawn with Vision. And then one which, although it speaks about it, it serves as a wake-up call to us, Seawater and Sand, 1985. That's right, chalk dust. So the conversation about the movement of our people has been going on for a long time. One of the things that we should always stop for a minute and think about, the shortcomings of us as a people in the Caribbean. When we were colonies of Britain, there was no such thing as a movement problem. We moved from island, from territory to territory as colonists. I have relatives in St. Lucia, in Guyana, in St. Vincent, in Trinidad. All of them started here in Barbados and moved out into the other territories. Why? Not because they just wanted to leave Barbados, but they went looking for a better life. Leave in St. Lucie, go to Panama, pick up his family and moves through the Caribbean. Ends up living in St. Lucia. As an 11-year-old, I had my first trip to visit my family in St. Lucia. So we've always, as Barbadians, moved to different places for a better life. And we've never had, as was mentioned in here earlier, I found it interesting, and I might digress for a minute, where a question was asked about being careful of the people who move. You may basically end up with criminal elements coming. Yet, thousands upon thousands of people come here from Europe on aeroplanes daily. I've never yet heard anyone question if any of those persons could have been, or were, or are of criminal character. It's interesting how we view ourselves when we have to deal with ourselves. The good thing about this, but it seems to have been lost on a lot of people, is that the migration is not one way. Is that it opens the door for those of us who can see opportunities and grasp them in other parts of CARICOM to do so. The problem is that we continue to tell ourselves that we cannot. That has been the major thing that has kept a lot of us within the 166 square miles that we live in, and you don't go out and explore and try other things. This is a good time for our young people to begin that process, to take advantage of opportunities that may present themselves in other parts of the region. And I can speak as an artist of being able to ply my trade all across the Caribbean. That even today, I can walk into any of the territories and people know who I am. Not from being a senator or a minister, but from being an artist, a Calypsonian. And I'm welcomed with open arms wherever I go. Not a problem. You come to the airport and somebody say, hey, John King, man, you come to do a show, whatever, blah, blah, blah. They say, no, I don't do that anymore. But they know who I am. So it would be impossible for me not to support this or to have any queries about the validity of it or what it means to us as a people. We've grown up with our parents telling us all the time, there's strength in numbers. But yet then when it's time to take that strength by getting the numbers, we start dodging and questioning and wondering if we're doing the right thing. Or you will hear people say things like, a chain is as strong as its weakest link. But then when we have the opportunity to strengthen the chain, people know what to tiptoe through the rose bush. It can't work. It's either you understand what you're trying to achieve, we know what the pros and the cons are. But I want to pick up from where Senator Nichols left off and talk about agriculture. I like to keep it real. Like I said, we could talk about figures and all these things, but I give you classic examples, simple things that you might not pay attention to. When was the last time in history that you could remember that you were able to get a simple thing like melons on a regular basis? So, and if you go back and see what we were doing in terms of planting and having people to produce these things for us, it is with the advent of persons coming in that you find out that you can have melons, a simple thing like melons, to make a drink when the morning comes for breakfast, or to use it other house. There are benefits of bringing people in. You go down into the square, which become very popular, Worthing Square. Who populates down there? And that popped up when Trinidadians, entrepreneurial ones, came into Barbados. Now you see others popping up in different areas. Example set, example followed. We can't allow myopia to stop us from doing the things that are going to be beneficial to us as a people and beneficial to us as a region. I myself take the opportunity to travel through the island sometimes just to see what other people are doing. One of the things that I noticed very early o'clock is that there are things that we do well here in Barbados that are absent from some of the other places. Opportunities for young entrepreneurs, not just young, but anybody who has the audacity, I can use that word, to get out and do things. A simple thing like Airbnb. It's cheaper in some of the other places to get land than it is to get here in Barbados. The opportunities in areas like that. We have had for many years, St. Lawrence Gap, which used to be, as I always tell people, the entertainment capital of the Caribbean for many, many years. I've been in the Gap playing music. I have top entertainers from Jamaica, top entertainers from St. Vincent, top entertainers from the United States come in and join us on stage in what used to be shipping back in those days. And amazed that you have all of this going on in 166 square miles. These are things that we did well. We can replicate them across the Caribbean, especially when you talk about in the early days of this movement of artists and artisans and stuff like that. We have skills. We have lots of them that can be exported across the Caribbean region. So let us not just think that there are people who are going to be coming into Barbados and all of a sudden now we are going to be overrun by people who are looking for welfare and all this sort of stuff. Because these are the things that will come out of the mouths of people who are inclined only to oppose. And when a fellow is hell-bent on opposing, sometimes these things might slip them. But the truth is, and I heard others talk about their experience, my parents left Barbados and went to England. I was actually born in England. They didn't go there, leaving the sun and stuff to go up in the cold for nothing. They had no choice at that point in time, but looking to better themselves. They went somewhere else. And history shows that we've had for a very, very long time migration. I heard people talk about Panama. Let us not forget that people went to Brazil. Let us not forget people went to Nicaragua. People went to Cuba from Barbados. And when you travel to these places, even in I think it was in Curacao, I was able to find places in all of them which are called Little Barbados, where our people, yes, and Guyana, yeah, where our people, generations of them, have done very well for themselves. So we must open up our minds, and for those who believe that you're always going to get 100% of people agreeing with you, no, you will not. But there are times when you are doing things that are right, that there are some people that you have to bring along with you, screaming and bawling. You have to drag them along. They probably won't get it. But in life, you have to do what you have to do. For those of us who have children, you will know. No two children are going to be the same. You got to deal with them differently. You got one that if you tell them, stop doing something, you get it one time. You got another one, you got to talk over and over and over and over and over and over until they get it. So this may be one of those occasions, Mr. President, where this government is going to have to drag some people along on this issue, screaming and bawling. But you cannot be deterred. Neither can you be frightened. Neither can you backtrack. Because if we don't do this now, I am telling you in this chamber that we will pay the price of it later on. The rest of the world is becoming very insular. You look at what's happening in Europe, you listen to the same type of rhetoric from politicians on that end about Africans coming into Europe, about all these other people coming into Europe. I know as a youngster, as a child in England, again, I hear my parents talk all the time about a man by the name of Enoch Powell. And all his thing was to get the darkies back out to the West Indies and to Africa, get them out. They say they're coming in, they're taking the jobs. They're coming in, they're doing all of this thing, and they're coming in, they're bringing crime, and they're doing all this. We've heard this over and over again. I might sound a little passionate about this particular issue because I am. Because the truth is, when you have people spouting these things, you know very well that they have not had either the lived experience or they don't have any clue of what our own people had to deal with when they themselves had to migrate to other places to make better for themselves. This is not an issue to be trifled with, neither is it an issue to be politicized. This, Mr. President, the way I see it, is the last chance for us to correct an unfortunate mistake that was made many years ago with the Federation. I will say this publicly. If Europe, who for centuries fought amongst themselves, could find it possible and important to form a European Union, they didn't form it because they love each other bad, but they understand that the economic powers in the world was changing. And if we, in this section of the world, don't get it right, don't do this, don't make it work for us, there's nobody else who's going to be coming to your assistance. Do not fool yourselves. You have to take care of yourselves in this region. That is why moving people around becomes more and more important. There are things that we might not know or might not do well, that we can get those skills from others and vice versa. We're talking about food security and all the other things that we talk about. There will come a time when we may have to revisit the unfortunate COVID situation. Remember, not too long ago during that period, we were scrambling to get vaccines. Scrambling. Nobody outside of this region looked at us as being vulnerable or worthy of anything. We had to tag on to other places in order to get vaccines. You have too much capacity across the region for us to want to travel this road individually all the time. We talk about sustainability, it ain't sustainable. Not as individuals, we can't do it, but collectively we have a better chance. And we don't know what's to come. None of us in this room ever thought that we would have seen a pandemic. We all felt that, health was had come such a long way. We would never experience anything like that. But we did. And we are also, as was mentioned earlier, vulnerable to climate change. We need each other today more than we ever did in the past. And I would just reiterate that if under British rule, we could move around and work easily, it should not be difficult for us to do it for ourselves. People talked about, in the early days of education, a lot of Barbadians left and were head teachers and things in different parts of the very things. Our police band, just a little history for you, our police band, the very first Calypso steel band group that went to England from Trinidad was led by a Barbadian musician. A lot of the police bands, St. Lucia, Grenada, and other places were established by Barbadians. If you don't know, go and get some books and do a little reading. We have benefited from the persons who traveled outside, repatriating money and stuff to here. Imagine if we can do these things between ourselves. I see this as a first step. There are other things that we need to do that I've been calling for the time I can remember myself, but I won't talk about it in here. But it is important that these steps are taken to have a full integration of the Caribbean. From the dollar to the passport to all the other things that we need to get straightened out. Because, as I say, United States of America, it is very possible to have a United States in the Caribbean. It is very possible. We have tried in the past. It didn't work. But is there anything for us to harp on all the time? We look at that as a stepping stone. What did we learn from it? And how can we make it a reality going forward so that the next generations coming behind us will not be saying the same thing about the failure of us to do it, but would at least remember us as being the ones who put it in place. With those few words, sir, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Senator Reverend Morris.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me say that I consider myself very fortunate, but also honored to be part of a parliament that would try to enact legislation to ensure greater integration in the Caribbean. I can begin, sir, by saying many hands make light work. But I won't begin there. I would want to start by quoting from a speech by Norman Manley, I think it was in 1952 or 53, when he said on integration, and I quote, "If we fail to integrate, we are purblind, and we will be condemned at the bar of history." And I feel a sense of satisfaction today that he may very well escape that bar, that condemnation at the bar of history. And I'm sure Senator Walters will feel fortunate that he too may escape that condemnation at the bar of history. I want us to go back a little, because there are some things that are happening that even now, efforts are being made to throw out the integration movement. And one method that is used is that of creating fear. When you create fear, sir, you always stand in a corner, not moving forward, but looking for the next danger that never comes. The other thing is that we should analyze more of what happened before so that we do not make the mistakes of the past. And I say that, sir, because having studied a number of speeches on the whole federation issue, having looked at the role of Grantley Adams and Norman Manley, I have come to the conclusion then, and I'm still at that conclusion now, that there was a concerted effort by the former colonizers to ensure that there was no unity in the Caribbean, because Britain itself understood the consequences of having these territories move as one. At the hand of every federal meeting, important meeting, stood the gavel of the British. This goes way back. 1876, sir. Remember that we had a crisis here in Barbados called the Confederation Riots. Again, it was Britain's attempt. It was not the Caribbean's attempt. It was Britain's attempt to bring two things. One, Crown Colony government and a federation of the Caribbean states. It didn't work. But let us fast forward to the 1950s, when Caribbean leaders decided that they were going to integrate. We must understand the work, and I keep saying the work of Grantley Adams and Norman Manley, because these two were the ones who were pushing the effort. And every time that the Caribbean leaders met in Caribbean territories to decide on federation, when they went to Britain, it was changed. And therefore, the most important conferences were always held in Britain. And Britain understood why she did not want these Caribbean territories to unite. And the final conference in 1956 to decide on the Caribbean Federation, Britain imposed again its hand. Because if you look at all the information, even in an attempt to grant colonies independence, Britain ensured that in those independence charters that they had inscribed there that Britain had the right to repeal the independence order. They tried to keep the colonies apart. Sir, because you know by 1962, Jamaica it had one of the highest currencies in the world. They understood Jamaica's natural resources. They understood the natural resources of Guyana, and Guyana was never allowed to be part of that integration movement in those early days. That is what was happening. That our federation was thwarted, not necessarily by us, but by an outsider who tried to keep us apart because they knew what the effort or the effects of it. And that is why you always heard the Right Honorable or Right Excellency Granny Adams. He was always advocating for an independence within the Federation. It was never, and this is a myth that I hear touted in the Caribbean, in Barbados, that the Barbados Labour Party was against independence. It was never against independence. It was against going independence alone. But if I may move on, sir. When we look at the issues facing...
Well, once you get your thought together, just take your place for a minute. I'll ask the Deputy President to take the chair for a moment.
Sure. Madam Deputy President, the terms and the arguments that I hear were not only to the Caribbean. The United States of America in 1776 or 1773, around there, their main effort was, how do we get 13 clocks to tick together? There were 13 different colonies. And the same arguments were used by some of the states in the South and in the North. And what they did, what was carefully done by persons like Paine and all of them, all of the philosophers, they created an enemy and made the Americans seem as though we are the ones who will be targeted. And that fear of the enemy that never arose created a bond between all the states. I mean, it was never resolved anyhow. Even to this day, it is not resolved. Europe, again, only formed alliances at that time based on war. And as soon as the war was over, they went apart. As a matter of fact, in some alliances, we know that there was betrayal, especially when we consider the marriage between Hitler and Stalin. there was also betrayal. So don't let us knock ourselves too much. We are here. This is our time. And we will make a decision based on our people. I used to go to Jamaica every year. Thousands of teachers involved in the Caribbean Examination Council examinations. And if you want a perfect example of how we really, of Caribbean unity, you should see how we operated in Jamaica. We operated as people, human beings, not as a Trinidadian, not as a Jamaican, not as a Barbadian, but people of the Caribbean. And I hope the day will come when we can have a country called the United States of the Caribbean. And I hope that we can also change the name of the university to the University of the Caribbean. I hope that will come. But we share the same history. Each slave territory in the Caribbean operated on laws created in this parliament in Barbados. So we have the same cultural background, the same history. There is not much to divide us. In fact, there's more that unite us than divide us. And I believe that with all the industries, I look forward to the day when maybe Guyana could be the agricultural hub of the Caribbean, Barbados, the financial hub. You know, we need to move towards this. We must stop seeing people as different, because even if we are different, there's dignity in that difference. I believe even now, there are still efforts to stop this integration movement in the Caribbean. When you look at what international organizations try to do to us, they blacklist us. They impose restrictions on us that they themselves do not follow. Why, in that case, we can do like the Americans and see ourselves as being targeted and come together. And there are certain things that we should say about ourselves. Never again shall those things happen to us. That together, we are going forward. We are going forward to fight for ourselves, to ensure that our children and our children's children have a Caribbean in which they can live and in which they can prosper. It saddens me, madam, that as Senator Rogers virtually lamented, and Senator Boyce, the situation in Haiti. This is part of the Caribbean. And I believe that we should make every effort to do whatever is possible to help in that situation. These are persons who defeated 3 European armies. 3. When some Europeans wanted to know why, they put it on religion, that they had voodoo and the voodoo word. And what did the neighbor next door do? Start making, we call them the Chucky movies. That's what they started doing, to make it seem as though these people are obeah and witchcraft. And they put it in the movies. This, not me, because I really don't like things that, while they were watching things that uglier than me, so I could not watch it. But the truth is that narrative was created. But look at all of us. We have a cricket team. It may not be doing the best now, but there was a time when it ruled the world. And it shows what we can do when we come together. We can rule the world as well. It shows what we can do when we speak at the United Nations as one.
And if you could just hold for 1 minute so that the president could return.
Senator Reverend Rogers, please continue.
Thank you, sir. It only shows what we can do. How, we call you said who? Well, obviously, I display a type of wholeness and piety that is also evident in Senator Rogers, so I understand the mistake. But it goes to show what we can do if we come together as one. And I look forward to the day when we can make this Caribbean truly Caribbean. I believe that the fears of what kind of currency, what sort of, how we can travel from one place to the next. The truth is, Mr. President, I do not believe that in 2024 in the Caribbean, I should be moving from here to Trinidad to show a passport and all of that. The United States, they move from state to state. I think we need to think of ourselves at a higher level. And that we can compete in this world with anybody in any discipline. I always refer to my friend, Senator Maynard. I always refer to him because there's always this feeling that the better is someplace else. And even going to the doctors in England, and I mentioned that Senator Maynard was my physician. They thought, I didn't even know it was true. They said, well, he teach you to be doctors too. I didn't know that. So I'm saying that the quality that we need is right here in the Caribbean. And I believe the time has come, sir, for us to go full integration. We cannot seek to delay it any longer. We determine this time that we depend on and determine our own destiny. I thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Senator Reverend Morris.
Morris.
Any more speakers? No more speakers, please wrap up, Senator Dr. Maronite. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to, of course, thank all of the honorable speakers in the House today that stood on their feet and supported these amendments. I especially want to thank those on this side for their unequivocal support. There is something about contending. There's something about knowing that there will be challenges, but still being able to say unequivocally that despite the challenges that we will face, despite that we know that it is imperfect, that we will stand behind it. And so when questions arise as to messaging, when questions arise as to communication, that is exactly the positions that have been taken in this honorable chamber. That is exactly the messaging that it is needed to go forth to the society. That as policymakers, we are standing unequivocal in our support for regional integration and for freedom of movement. And I would hope that all of us on this and on the other side, in the spaces that we occupy, will send that message, will use our own influence to be able to encourage and bring along the population around this cause, Mr. President. Certainly, the government has already said, and our record, Mr. President, is clear in terms of our support, in terms of where we stand on this measure, where we stand on the value and benefits of regional integration and freedom of movement, Mr. President. And we will continue to do so through our strong political leadership, our strong policy initiatives in order to continue to send the necessary signals, Mr. President, throughout the society to all concerned about regional integration, value, like I said, the benefits, and where we stand. Mr. President, there have been questions around, interestingly, from those who say, I support, let's just make sure that security is okay. I support, but let's make sure that everything is in place for health and education. I support, but. Mr. President, one, I want to indicate that in the context of the freedom of movement, the full freedom of movement that the heads have committed to, that there will be a 3-year transition period in the first instance, and that 3-year transition period is to allow member states to put all of the necessary administrative and procedural arrangements in place. As I indicated in my opening, Mr. President, CARICOM is working with an international agency in order to be able to undertake a study, to be able to address some of the challenges, some of the hurdles that are stemming implementation. So we will have that 3-year transition period. But not only will there be a 3-year transition period, there will then also be a 7-year transition period to allow member states to be able to address and to feel comfortable that they have all of the necessary measures in place to afford in respect of health and education and all of the other social infrastructure that needs to be in place. More than that, Mr. President, I also want to indicate that the regime has always provided that member states, if they feel that their systems are being overwhelmed, that they can temporarily suspend the regime if they are able to show and have an indication that they are being overwhelmed, like I said, are flooded. And furthermore, Mr. President, it also includes caveats that yes, well, under the Skills Nationals regime that you can move, but states have the right to refuse that movement if they believe that that person, one, is a threat to security, public health, or that there will be an overdue burden on the national purse, Mr. President. All of these measures are in place and will be in place as we move on, as the heads have indicated, under full free movement, Mr. President. So this is not going to be a regime. It has not been a regime. And the intent is not to unleash, Mr. President, in any way that will impinge either on the rights of the opportunities of nationals. I also want to add, Mr. President, that to the question of whether or not particularly this government is understanding, taking note of the concerns that have been expressed by citizens, I would want to say, Mr. President, no, I'll stay away from the political thing and move on, because I believe that a lot of that is fear-mongering that we use this as a political football rather than sending the correct messaging and communication that have been asked for. We are deliberately creating undue consternation. But, Mr. President, I do want to say that under the Barbados Labour Party, we've moved from an unemployment rate when we came in 2018 of 11% to an unemployment rate of 8.3%. And a lot of that is by opening up employment in new areas, Mr. President. We heard one of the honorable senators speaking to the issue of the construction gateway. And, Mr. President, I can identify that under the construction gateway, 99 persons out of 110 were given opportunities to be able to work almost immediately after they have finished, with average salaries of around 30K. And we're doing that as well, Mr. President, in the area of artificial intelligence as well. Mr. President, under Export Barbados, we're opening up new opportunities in life sciences, not standing on traditional sectors, but also as well making sure that we open up new opportunities and pathways for young people. $1 million into the fashion industry, Mr. President, was announced and is being used to ensure that creatives also have the opportunities to be able to have investment and to be able to export as well, Mr. President. So we are fully cognizant and we are taking tangible steps, Mr. President, to make sure that even as we support regional integration, even as we support freedom of movement, that we ensure that we are providing and upskilling Barbadian young people. Mr. President, if I begin to speak about the work of the trust fund and fund access, again, in capitalizing entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs, again, to be able to export, Mr. President. And I can speak to many more initiatives, but I'm making the general point, is that one does not negate the other, Mr. President. One does not negate the others. There is a fundamental value that has been said on the floor by a number of senators here, an intrinsic value, a historical imperative to freedom of movement and regional integration, Mr. President. Mr. President, I also want to point out, and again, as has been indicated by the honorable senators, that the idea that we are going to be flooded and are flooded by people who will be coming in en masse is not necessarily borne out, particularly under the skills regime. If we look at the statistics from 2010 to 2020 to 2023, the Barbados Accreditation Council has issued 3,181 skills certificates and certified 1,288 from 2010, Mr. President, to 2023. There's no en masse flooding, Mr. President. And moreover, if you look at the categories that are moving, Mr. President, it is those categories already that would have been moving, like, Mr. President, those with university degrees that are already moving. And what we now need to do is to be able then to further, and I agree, educate the other categories, agriculture workers, domestics, in order then to be able to also take advantage, Mr. President, of the regime that we have before us as well. Mr. President, finally, I also want to say, because I think a lot has been said on the floor, to be able to allay the fears that were identified and answer some of the critical questions as well that were identified. But I just want to remind us, the people who are moving here from other countries, and particularly for the Caribbean, they're paying taxes, Mr. President. They are paying taxes. They are coming here and utilizing services, Mr. President. They have to rent houses and drive cars or take the bus, Mr. President. They're paying VAT, Mr. President. So they're making contributions. And yes, as well, they're going to pay sometimes the health levy too, Senator Maynard. But they are making contributions. We're given the impression almost like people are coming and they're leeching, as opposed to appreciating that they are also as well making a benefit and contributing as well to the economy, to the country, and its development. And so that in this discourse, we have to be fair. We have not, Mr. President, to perpetuate the idea, again, that we are going to be overtaken, overwhelmed, unfairly treated, displacing our own, Mr. President, in this effort. Mr. President, as I close, again, as I commend the amendments to this House, particularly for the categories, I go back, again, to the very ethos of the movement, go back to the very ethos of the people of the region that need to benefit the most, Mr. President, from this initiative. The very people who have worked, the very people whose hands, Mr. President, have toiled. And we are here, Mr. President, as we, and I hope that this House, and that's been said on the House, as we have agreed on the value of these amendments, Mr. President, I want to assure again the people of Barbados the continued commitment of this government to their livelihoods and to making sure that the regional integration movement works for them. Mr. President, I beg that this bill not be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do not leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honorable the Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Madam Chairman, permission again to call and close this again.
Permission granted.
Clauses 1 through 4.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clauses 1 through 4 do stand part.
The question is that clauses 1 through 4 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Report.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported the passing of one bill in committee.
Mr. President, I beg that this bill not be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg that this bill be now passed and be cited as the Caribbean Community Movement of Skilled Nationals Amendment Act 2024.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Caribbean Community Movement of Skilled Nationals Amendment Act 2024. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited.
Order number 3, sir. In the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Chapter 225, the vesting in the National Housing Corporation of 2 parcels of land situate at Castle Grant Plantation in the parish of St. Joseph in this island, more particularly described in the schedules thereto, for a public purpose, namely housing development.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, this is a simple matter. I believe we have spoken at great length on multiple occasions about the government's housing program, housing agenda, and the acquisition or vesting of lands in the various institutions of government for the purpose of achieving the government's housing objectives. And so I don't intend to spend any real time on this particular matter because it is almost a continuation of the same points which have been made. And on this occasion, we are the matter before the Honorable Chamber is the vesting of land at Castle Grant Plantation in the parish of St. Joseph, 2 lots of land, Lot 1A and Lot 1C. They constitute respectively 0.747 hectares of land, and in the second instance, 4.142 hectares of land. These lands, Mr. President, are to be vested in the National Housing Corporation for the purpose of continuing, as I've said, the government's housing program. And with these very few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this resolution do now pass.
The question is that this resolution do not pass. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This resolution is therefore now passed. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to express the appreciation of the government of Barbados for the contribution of all honorable senators in today's debates. It was rich, it was full, and it was reflective, Mr. President, of the standard to which this chamber has become accustomed. I would wish on this occasion as well, Mr. President, to therefore indicate that we have come to the end of government's business for the day and to adjourn the Honorable Senate sine die.
The question is that the Honorable Senate be now adjourned sine die. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. Senate stands adjourned, sine die.